Hello, everyone. This presentation was originally set to happen at the Risky Business Medical Negligence Conference that we put on a couple weeks ago now. Unfortunately, we ran late, so Charles Gluckstein and I have decided we'd do these webinars to give everyone access to the content that they missed that day. Today I'm going to be talking about using medical records, particularly electronic medical records in these cases, and issues that you need to consider and look into when you're dealing with electronic medical records. Technology certainly has changed the way that we practice, the way that we live our lives. In my home, in my office, technology has changed how things are done, and that is equally true in the healthcare system. So we need to have a sense of how that can actually impact our practice. It's important that we learn to adapt, we understand the issues that present themselves, because these are things that are going to be more and more prevalent in our area of practice. So what is a record? Sorry, I just got to get the technology here, guys. I'm sorry. There we go. Okay, so what is an electronic medical record, EMR, or EHR, electronic health record? There is no standard system in place. These are computerized records, and it can include anything from nursing notes to imaging, doctor's reports. All of these things can be encompassed in a medical record. Now they can be actually all housed in an internal electronic system. There is no one specific system in place. There's many, many different ones. So these are just some of the programs that are available in the marketplace today. They are all different. And not only are they all different, but in fact, they can actually all be customized based upon the needs of a particular care provider. So dependent upon whether it's a hospital or a doctor's office, there may be different needs of different healthcare providers. And even within these programs, for example, Epic has actually different programs for different needs. Their programs can be customized to different areas of medicine. So for example, they have a program called Cupid, which is for cardiology, Stoke for obstetrics, Bones is the orthopedic program, Radiant for radiology, Lumens for endoscopy, Beacon for oncology. So as you can see, there's a lot of different options in the system. In Canada, the three main providers are Meditech, Cerner, and Epic. And while there are many others, you will certainly see them in your practice. These are the three biggies that have a decent market share and that you're certainly going to come across in your practice. So looking at some of these individually, Meditech is one. So I've got a little screenshot here. This is an example of a critical care flow sheet available from Meditech. Meditech as a company has been in Canada for a long time. This is not a new system. So Meditech's been available approximately 35 years in Canada. Humber River Hospital actually has had Meditech in use there for quite a while. They were able to actually integrate 15 separate interfaces into one patient data source. And the idea behind this is really to increase the patient experience, the ease of operating for healthcare providers. Sorry about the coughing, I've got a bit of a cold, so you'll have to bear with me through this. But the idea behind electronic medical records is certainly the care experience. So care providers are now able to access records off-site. Specialists can access the full record from their own offices. There doesn't need to be a situation where patients are carting back and forth various reports to different specialists. They actually have access to everything. Patients also will have access to a lot more of their chart. There's my health system where the idea eventually, it's not fully functional yet, but the idea will be that you can log on and have access to all your own records. And some hospitals actually have that in place now. And I imagine that in the future, this is going to be something that is readily available across lots of different healthcare institutions. But turning back to this critical care flow sheet here from Meditech, the idea of me putting some of these into the presentation is to give broad strokes samples of what are healthcare providers looking at in the care setting. So most of us have not been care providers. We've not been nurses or physicians or other healthcare providers in the hospital. There are some exceptions to that, but for the most part, we haven't been the healthcare providers. We don't necessarily have an intimate understanding of how these systems operate. And it is important to have that sense, and in some cases that can absolutely play a role. So one thing that you'll see in these systems, that if a nursing staff in an ICU were looking at the critical care flow sheet, you've got a couple patients listed here. And when you click on one of the patients, clearly the green highlighted patient's been clicked on, additional information will pop up. So the nurse has got all of that information in front of them. You'll also see slightly to the right-hand side of the screen on the second patient down there that there are some highlighted results. These are new lab reports. There could be some new imaging available. It shows the nurse right there what has popped up, who the patients are under his or her care, and they've got it all right there, right in front of them. You know, we have to consider also how these systems could actually create new areas of negligence or increase the standard of care that may be expected when care providers have coming right to a central desk new imaging. It's been uploaded, it's right here, it's highlighted. There's no excuse for not seeing that and dealing with critical results that are identified to you as critical right there. You know, if there's delays, things popping up, an over-reliance upon a system when a result should be available, you still might need to call down to the lab if there's a reliance upon the fact that, oh, it's okay, as soon as the lab result will be available, it'll be right there. But significant time goes by and there was some system malfunction. There was an issue with the lab tech not loading in properly. So all of these things are things that we could consider as being potential issues in various cases, depending upon the facts of the case. This is an example of a program from Cerner FirstNet, an example of what would be visible in an emergency room, emergency record here. So each line on this record is a separate patient, and there's a number of different pieces of information available here. So for example, you've got the room information on the far left. Then you've got numbers, most of them here 2 orange numbers and 1, 3 down there. Those are the CTAS levels that have been assigned to the patients, or the acuity level. Then I've got the patient's name. Those colored boxes are the care providers that have been listed on having care of that particular patient. Then you've got the primary complaints or details of the admission. Further on the right-hand side is where there's going to be different pieces of information available, vitals, lab results, imaging, things like that. On the right, there's also those red boxes on the right. Those are the length of stay. So this is particularly concerning in an emergency situation where you've got people who might have been there for quite a significant period of time. You know, I'm sure a lot of us have had that experience where you go to the emergency room and you're there for quite a long time. You wonder if you've been forgotten. This doesn't allow that to happen. Also, as I mentioned on the past screen, new information that pops up, new lab results, things of that nature pop onto the screen, let the nurse know that or physicians or other care team member that new result is available. And again, I suggest that we should really consider that these systems might actually create new areas of negligence that hadn't been considered before. So for example, previously you've got a paper file, you know you've got the right file, you put the information into your file. Now, what if a nurse clicks on the wrong person, enters the wrong information? I was recently reviewing a file for an elderly gentleman who had experienced a stroke, and all of a sudden in the middle of the record, I see a notation about cocaine usage and obtaining street drugs. And I thought, that doesn't fit. But of course, I asked my clients, you know, what was this about? They had no idea. He'd never used drugs in his life. It had never been a concern. It wasn't something I thought fit in his record, but it was clearly something that was put in the wrong record. Now, that was very clear, very obvious in my case. It's not always going to be so clear. And certainly that is something to consider. Is this information put in the correct chart? Is this information about this particular patient? Critical results, are they left flashing? Have they been checked and looked at? That information is right there, right in front of them. What about copy and pasting histories? So previously you'd have no choice, but you'd have to write out a history on it for a new patient. Now, if that patient has had a prior visit to the emergency room, you might have the opportunity to copy and paste that history. What if something's changed? What if there's a new critical piece of information not included? What if medication dosing or types have been changed and there's an over-reliance on the system in order to be able to know what medications and history is relevant to that patient. I always also look at dictation notes when I'm looking at a new medical record. So when were notes dictated? Was it before or after an adverse event or a near miss or poor outcome? Did the person dictating the note know about that when they did it? If the note is dictated contemporaneously, like immediately after the surgery, shortly thereafter, or they consult, more reliance can be put on it. It's done right away. It's going to be very close to that assessment, and how can you question that as much? But also the question of when was it then put into the chart and dictated. So they may, or transcribed, excuse me. So I had a case once where a patient was managed by a hospitalist. They were the most responsible physician. There was then a consult requested by neurology. The neurologist dictated a note. The audio file was available within the chart, but the transcription of the actual paper note wasn't put in for a couple of days. And so ultimately this patient was discharged. The neurologist's note and concerns and some of the tests recommended weren't done. And there was a poor outcome because that information wasn't utilized. So this is something to consider in terms of the care picture. Another program that's available, and it may not be particularly OBICs, but are perinatal monitoring programs, and they have their own functionality to understand and wrap your mind around. Basically, this is monitoring that labor and delivery wards will utilize. There are electronic fetal heart monitoring. That's what you see here. You've got mom down at the bottom showing the contractions. Up top is the fetal heart monitor. And there's some really great elements of this program for the care team to improve the experience, to improve care delivered, including central monitoring. So at a central nursing desk, they can see the various different patients right from there. There's bedside monitoring. There's also remote monitoring. So for example, if an obstetrician is on call and the nurses are providing the patient care and have some concerns, they can call. The obstetrician can actually log into the chart, take a look at the strip themselves. And that functionality, again, it's supposed to improve patient care. It allows for the obstetrician to do that review from home without being concerned, having to come in for a false alarm. It can also be integrated into other hospital systems, so those records are still recorded within the wider system in use. In OBICs in particular, it actually allows for annotations to be made on the fetal heart monitoring strip. If there's a changeover of staffing, they can see the notes made by the prior staff to see, how long has there been a lack of variability? How long have these decelerations been taking place? All of these things they can take. Of course, they could look at the strip, but they also have those notes of concern. There may be other information to, other circumstances that are noted on the strip that are relevant. These systems can also have alarms in place that are a part of the system. So there might be a threshold where if certain concerns start being seen by the, being picked up by the system, lights and alarms start flashing to alert the team that something might be going on here. Please look at this patient, take a look at this. And they can be silenced or they can be shut off. And so is that happening? Is that something the team should have been alert to something going on? And have that an extra added safety precaution that's been silenced or ignored? That is something to consider. So turning to requesting electronic records. So how does that change the requesting process? Well, it can in a number of ways. So certainly you can make your basic initial request. Ask for all hospital records. Requesting all hospital records, I can tell you from experience, does not mean you're going to receive all hospital records, but make the request, see what you get, have a critical eye on those records. Does it appear that everything's there? Is there anything missing? Different hospitals or clinics have different procedures. I can tell you from experience that often when we're dealing with a substantial amount of electronic records, that the hospital records department goes into the electronic chart, clicks off the various things to print out, send to counsel, or if it's a patient requesting, whoever the third party is. And they then send those results off. If it's something that they don't think is relevant, they don't think is part of the official chart, what have you, or they just missed something, then that may not form part of the chart. I've had a couple of scenarios recently where I've assumed something's missing. For example, I've had electronic nursing notes be missing from what I've received. Contact back the health records department, told you've had everything. And it's not until counsel gets involved and I ask for an affidavit of documents that I then receive a copy of these notes. And that can be certainly concerning. If you don't have them at the early stages, you may have had an expert review your file. They don't have critical pieces of information. It's not sufficient to get this information a week or two before the discovery, just as part of a standard affidavit of documents. Make sure you request that affidavit early on so that you have all of the information. This can also happen with doctor charts as well. So if there's specialists or physicians working within the hospital that maintain their own office chart, that might not form part of the hospital chart and wouldn't have been available to the health records department to print off. I had a circumstance recently where it's not a medical negligence matter, but a specialist my client had seen. I contacted him to get an opinion on a particular element of the case. And in my course of my discussions with him, I was addressing with him something that was a concerning element, that my client hadn't complained about a particular symptom that was crucial. And he said, "Oh, yes, she did." And I said, "Well, I'm glad you remember that," because he said, "No, it's not that I remember it. I have emails from the client in my office chart that showed what this patient was complaining about at that point in time." Well, that was not something that I was ever provided at any time prior to that discussion with that doctor. And so that can be relevant in these cases, making sure when the physicians deliver their affidavit documents, do they have an office chart? Is there anything in that chart that's different from the hospital chart? These are things that we need to explore. Some things do require specific requests. Fetal heart monitoring strips, those electronic strips, do need to be requested specifically. They will not send them to you just as part of the chart you've requested. Same thing with imaging. You'll receive the reports from an MRI or a CT or X-ray. You're not going to receive the actual images unless you request that specifically from the imaging department usually. And then in my personal experience, I found that electronic nursing notes, for some reason, they don't always come with the chart, and it's something that I'm needing to be very particular about. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about audit trails or audit logs. If you're not familiar with what that is, essentially that is a metadata, a piece of information that's about the computer data for the system. So what interactions have taken place with the system, what information about who, when, and what they did to the system. Now, this isn't going to show you exactly what they did, but it's going to tell you the information about their actions. So, for example, it might include information about late entries, deleted entries, modified entries. It can also be used for privacy and security purposes. So, for example, the information in a hospital chart cannot be accessed by any person who's employed by the hospital. It can only be accessed by the healthcare providers who are working on your file, and that is something to consider for the hospital. They want to make sure that they are keeping proper security for patients' privacy rights. Then, of course, reviews after the event. Was there a near miss or a critical incident that the hospital is reviewing and wanting to take a look at what happened and delve into how did this happen and how can we avoid it in the future? That can be important as well. It can show, as I said, the interactions by time, also by work-ins, the login station, action codes, how long the access was, all of that information is there. If there's modifications, you might also need to request something called a revision history. So if you're familiar with Word, there's something called track changes, and it essentially shows you what was there before, what was taken out, what was replaced, and the revision history is essentially similar to that, shows you what the modification was. Because, as I said, the audit data isn't going to show you what the modification was, just that that happened. So you would have to ask specifically and separately for a revision history. I argue that this is not something that is necessary in every single case. So full disclosure, not every lawyer would agree with that. Some suggest that this should be something we request on every case. I'm not sure a hospital counsel or hospitals would love to hear that because it's a lot of effort and time, or that they would agree to it, frankly, unless it can be demonstrated to be relevant and useful for that particular case. But this is significant amounts of data. So for example, I recently requested audit data with respect to access of a particular MRI image at a particular time. And I got over 60 pages of data that looked something like this. This isn't from my case, but this is essentially what it looked like. Excuse me. And that was with respect to that one tiny little action, not about nursing additions or lab reports or physician reports or access to those reports or reviews of the chart by different team members, alterations of the chart. So you can imagine if my 60 pages that I got related to solely that audit data on accessing a particular image, with that level of detail included, you can imagine what you would get if you asked for everything. And for that reason, I would suggest that it's simply not reasonable to ask for everything in every single case. So you also need to be aware of information that you don't understand. So there can be codes that you don't understand. There can be interactions that just don't quite make sense. It's very computer text, and you require an expert to interpret it for you. That is something that you need to consider. So not just an information technology specialist, but also someone who knows and has knowledge of the particular program, the particular software that you're dealing with. That is a key piece. And in fact, if you want to use records in court and have them presented at a trial, you're going to need to have that expert to present and interpret the data. It's not enough to use a common sense approach and say, well, there was a modification here, and I know that this information didn't make sense, and my client has other information, and this validates it. You got to have that assessment of the data for the court, for the judge, for the jury, to make them understand how does this data apply to this record, and is this in fact a code which applies to this particular piece of information that you are speaking about. Discovery issues with respect to electronic records. So you'll get the printouts. We've talked about that. You'll get a printout of the records, or you might get it on disk, but essentially it's a paper copy of the records. But again, that doesn't show you what was seen by the hospital staff. So screenshots, for example, might be useful to you. What was the visual of the staff? What did they see? You might ask for screenshots of the chart. The audit data, the audit trail we just talked about, you could ask for that, in particular in reference to a particular part of the chart, particular point in time. That can help make the request a little bit more manageable. You can actually also request, in some cases, an Excel sheet of the data. So it might, if you're getting a significant amount of data, that might be helpful. If you're only looking for modifications, deletions, a particular type of interaction, that might be helpful to be able to sort it for you, especially if you're getting hundreds and thousands of pages of information that, you know, to make sense of. You might want something like that. You might also want a staff training manual if you want to understand what the staff were told and how to interact with it. What did they know about the chart and how it was, and how to utilize these programs. That might be something you can ask for. A data dictionary might be something else. Data dictionary will, you know, provide you with names of modules, events, types and descriptions of codes or acronyms. All of these things could be useful to you. You may also want to ask for live access, an undertaking for, if requested, to attend at the hospital or the clinic to take a look at the chart as it appeared to the team, to give you an idea of what they were seeing. If you just can't get around the fact that there's got to be something missing here, or there's a reference to something you haven't received, it might be something that you do to go and access it. Are there alarms you have been informed are part of this program that you don't see them? You want to know, in terms of being able to present this evidence at a trial, what alarms, what codes, what things were appearing on the screen for the health professionals. So I want to lastly talk about a case study that my office dealt with that involved live access and some of these issues that in terms of electronic records, you can see in action how some of this came into play. So this did deal with the system OBIX that I mentioned previously, and it talked about, sorry, I've lost my program here. So the OBIX system has alarms and lights, as I was mentioning, flashing warnings. It involves a amount of information about the fetal heart monitoring, the mum's contractions, there are annotations on it, all of those things. So we had requested prior to discoveries a copy, essentially a read-only copy of this information on disk. So this was a case Charles Gluckstein handled, and he and his co-counsel requested a copy of the program. They wanted to be able to take a look at it, see how it operates. That request was made many different times, going back and forth with hospital counsel, who also didn't know if this was possible. We got to remember that hospital counsel may deal with these, issues all the time, but they may not have had this request before. It may be a brand new program, and in this case, it was a new program, and it had only been operating for a very short time in the hospital. So, excuse me, counsel may not have been aware of all of these issues, or even if it's possible to get a soft copy sent to counsel to interact with. At any rate, what ended up happening is that there was an agreement that counsel could attend at the hospital to take a look at the program, see how it operated. Ultimately, that's what we did, and went on numerous occasions to learn about the functionality of the system, and even actually on one occasion, a clinical educator was made available to look at the system, to answer functionality questions, and it allowed us to learn about the system in practice and see things that weren't available in the chart we received. For example, this was where it first came up that these alarms and these lights were flashing during this labor. They were silenced. There's also information showing that when they were silenced in the program, that was not available and was not part of the paper printout. These things are really important to understand the whole picture, and very impactful, frankly, in a case like this, when there's a birth injury and there were actually warnings coming out through the system that the team wasn't appropriately understanding or wasn't acting on at any rate. What also happened as a result of all of this is that the discovery ultimately proceeded on site at the hospital. Since they weren't able to provide us with a copy of the chart that we were able to have to put to the obstetrician in this file, the agreement was ultimately made to do the discovery in a boardroom on site at the hospital, have the chart on a screen and go through it and be able to put it to the doctor. What happened? What were you thinking? What was going on at this particular interval? Do you agree that alarm was taking place here? Do you agree that the reason for the alarm was X? Do you see the flashing light here? Was this what you were seeing on that particular day? Did you understand what that meant? All of these kinds of things. Did you consider taking action at this stage? All of these things were put to the doctor at the discovery on site and wouldn't have been able to happen had this discovery been taking place in a traditional boardroom at a reporting center where we don't have access to the chart. So these are some of the issues that can come up in some of these cases. There's certainly issues that we should be considering, and at a bare minimum, gaining an understanding of how these systems work and how we can use them to our advantage in these cases, because there certainly are advantages to being able to see it's no longer, something could be erased from a chart. There has to be a data trail to what happened and all the interactions. So those are my comments. Hopefully short and sweet for everyone to be able to manage on a lunch hour, quickly see some of the ways that you can use these charts and things to think about that perhaps you hadn't thought about before. I'm going to see if there are any questions posted today. It doesn't look like anything has been posted on the question and answer, but if anyone would like to send me questions, I would be more than happy to try to answer that in the future. Send me an email or contact me by phone. Anything like that's perfectly fine, and hopefully you found this useful. Have a good day.